Hey everybody, welcome back to Chapter 3, Section 3. This is a continuation of sorts of the last video. The last video went over how to find the equation when given the focus or the directrix or both. So here we're going to go backwards. I'm going to give you the equation and you're going to figure out the focus or the directrix or both. So all these formulas here are the same as they were in the last section of the notes. If you have a parabola opening up or down, it'll be in y equals. And if you have a parabola opening sideways, meaning it's opening left or right, then you'll have everything in x equals. That being said, let's just go ahead and get started. So you have your equation of y equals 3 over 5x squared. But remember, the formula is 1 over 4p times x squared. So what you want to do is, if it's already in y equals or x equals, just set that number next to the x squared equal to 1 over 4p. And so in this case, if it's a fraction, you'll want to solve it as if it's like a proportion, meaning cross multiply and divide. So what's 3 times 4p? 12p. Don't forget that p, okay? It's not 3 times 4, it's 3 times 4p. So it's 12p equals 5 times 1 is 5. So I have 12p equals 5, which means I need to divide both sides by 12. And so I'm going to get p equals 5 over 12. And I'll just leave that as a fraction. I think it's easier to leave it as a fraction rather than convert it to a decimal. So once you know your p, then I'm going to ask you, what's your focus, your directrix, and your axis of symmetry? So the focus and directrix, plug in the p. Remember, the directrix is the opposite sign of the p. The focus is exactly the p. And if it's in y equals, make sure you put in the y coordinate. And then your axis of symmetry is going to be x equals 0 for a y equals equation, and it'll be y equals 0 for an x equals equation. So that's pretty easy to remember, because the reason why it's at x equals 0 or y equals 0 is because the vertex is at 0, 0. You'll recall from the last video that the formulas get a little bit more complex when the vertex is not at 0, 0. But the focus of this lesson is for when the vertex is at the origin or at 0, 0. So back to number 1, I'm going to plug in 5 over 12 for my directrix. So my directrix is just y equals negative 5 over 12. My focus is just 0, 5 over 12. And then my axis of symmetry, or AOS, is simply x equals 0. And that's all there is to say about number 1. So number 2, I'm going to take that number that's by the x squared, negative 8 over 7. You can just pair the negative, just pick a number for it to be with. It doesn't matter which one, if you pick the 8 to be negative or the 7 to be negative. But, usually when there's a fraction written, the negative's written on the side. So when you're going to cross multiply and divide, like I said, just put it with one of the numbers. So I put the negative with the 8. And I'll set that equal to 1 over 4p. And I'll cross multiply. So negative 8 times 4p is negative 32p. And then I'll equal it to 7 times 1, so that's 7. So I'm going to divide by negative 32. And so p will equal negative 7 over 32. So once you know your p, everything else should be pretty easy. Your directrix is y equals, so I'll just put a dir. So y equals, and then it's the opposite sign, so positive 7 over 32. And your focus is just 0, the p number, negative 7 over 32. And my axis of symmetry is at x equals 0. And that's everything to say about number 2. So number 3, we have an equation in x equals, but the process will still be the same. You have 3 equal to 1 over 4p. So we have a whole number. Anytime you have a whole number, just throw it over 1. So when you cross multiply, you're doing 1 times 1, so that's 1, equals 3 times 4p, so that's 12p. So we'll divide both sides by 12, and so p will equal 1 over 12. And so now my directrix will have to be in x equals form. And so I'll say x equals negative 1 over 12. My focus will be in the x coordinate, and I will not flip the sign, so positive 1 over 12 comma 0. And then my axis of symmetry is not x equals 0, it's now y equals 0. And that's everything to say about number 3. So number 4, it's not solved for x or y, so you need to solve it for x or y. The one you know which to solve for is the one that's not being squared. So it says 2x minus 1/2 y squared equals 0. So I just need to add 1/2 y squared to the other side. And I'm going to solve this for x because x is not being squared. So 2x equals 0 plus 1/2 y squared is just 1/2 y squared. And so I'll divide everything by 2. And so what is 1/2 divided by 2? Think about it like this. If I cut a sandwich in half, and then I cut that half into a half, I now have a quarter. Or if you have 50 cents and you cut that in half, how much money do you have? You have a quarter. So I have x equals 1 over 4 y squared. So I just take 1 over 4, set it equal to 1 over 4p. These fractions are exactly the same, so what do you think p has to equal? P should equal 1. And so if that confuses you, when you cross multiply, you're going to get 1 times 4 is 4, and 1 times 4p is 4p. So you get 4p equals 4p, so divide both sides by 4. And anything divided by itself is 1, so even if you cancel this out, you're still going to put a 1. So don't cancel out the right-hand side, because that'll tempt you to put 0. We cancel things out because we don't need to put a 1 by the letter. So yeah, either way you want to go about it, the mental math side or still doing the proportion, you'll still get 1. All right. That being said, we need to answer the question of what's our focus and directrix. So my directrix here is flip the sign, and then it'll be x equals, since my equation was x equals, so x equals negative 1. My focus is positive 1, 0. And then my axis of symmetry is at y equals 0. And that's everything to say about number 4. Number 5, a similar example. I have 14x squared minus 2y equals 0. So I'll need to add 2y to the other side. And so the y letter does not have the power of 2 with it. So I'll want to solve for that letter. Because you'll need to say x equals something y squared or y equals something x squared. So divide both sides by 2. And then we can rearrange it. Y equals 7x squared. So take that 7, equal it to 1 over 4p. And then like I said before, if it's a whole number, throw it over 1. So you can cross multiply and divide with something. And so 7 times 4p is 28p equals 1 times 1 is 1. Divide both sides by 28. And you get p equals 1 over 28. And so now that we have our p, we can identify our focus and our directrix. Our directrix will be, let's see, the equation's y equals, so the directrix will be y equals. So directrix will be y equals negative 1 over 28. Our focus will be at positive 1 over 28 in the y coordinate, since it was a y equals equation. And my axis of symmetry is now x equals 0. And that's going to wrap things up for number 5. And lastly, number 6, I have 3x plus 7y squared equals 0. So to solve it for a letter, the x is not being squared, so I'm going to solve it for x. So I'll get this 7y squared to the other side by subtracting it. 3x equals negative 7y squared. Divide both sides by 3, and you get x equals negative 7 over 3y squared. So set that number equal to 1 over 4p, so negative 7 over 3 equals 1 over 4p, and cross multiply and divide. We got 3 times 1 is 3 equals negative 7 times 4p, that's negative 28p. So I'll need to divide both sides by negative 28. And so I get a fraction answer, p equals negative 3 over 28. So my focus will be negative 3 over 28 in the x-coordinate, and then the y-coordinate will be 0. My directrix will be x equals, and I'll flip the sign, so positive 3 over 28. And then my axis of symmetry, since everything was x equals, the axis of symmetry will be y equals 0. And that's it for number 6. That's going to wrap it up for these notes. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.